At 62 years old, retired Sergeant Major William Keegan walked into a courtroom and handed over his Medal of Honor without protest, without a lawyer beside him, without anyone to hold his hand. There was no press, no audience, no ceremony. Just a judge reading off accusations that didn't match the man standing in front of her, and a decision already made long before he entered the room. He removed the medal from a velvet case, placed it on the bench, turned around and walked out. But what he didn't know was that someone in the back row had recorded everything. Daniel Rivas wasn't a reporter with credentials. He wasn't trying to go viral. He was the son of a soldier who died under Keegan's command, and the only reason he was in that courtroom was because something about the silence didn't feel right. 2 minutes and 13 seconds of footage captured a moment that would set off a firestorm. The video was uploaded without commentary, and within hours it became the center of a national reckoning. This story isn't about internet fame or political spin. It's about a man who gave everything for his country, only to have that same country try to erase him. It's about a war hero targeted not for what he did wrong, but for what he refused to cover up. And it's about a system that learned too late that some people won't stay quiet, even when silence would be easier. This is the story of a medal that meant more than medal, a reputation nearly destroyed, and the truth that refused to die. 9:17 a.m., William Bill Keegan stepped into the courtroom without breaking stride. He wore the same dark suit he used for military funerals, tailored shoulders, shoes shined to a mirror gloss. No hesitation, no confusion, just the kind of posture that came from decades of discipline. His chest no longer bore ribbons, and his nameplate was long gone, but everything about him still read soldier. The kind of soldier who'd seen more than he spoke about. The room was nearly empty, a few clerks seated off to the side, a federal, bailiff leaning back in his chair. One man in the back row, silent, recording with his phone. No press, no microphones, no cameras, no applause, no outrage. Just a slow erosion of a lifetime of service playing out beneath the hum of flickering lights and the dull scrape of a chair leg being moved. Judge Elaine Foster sat behind the bench. Her black robe looked heavier than usual. She adjusted her glasses, shifted in her seat, then cleared her throat. She didn't make eye contact. Not yet. In front of her sat a folder with just 6 pages. That was all it took. 6 pages to undo 3 decades of sacrifice, missions, injuries, and impossible decisions. 6 pages to erase the Medal of Honor awarded in 2008 for heroism under direct fire in the mountains of Kunar Province. Sergeant Major Keegan, she began, this hearing has concluded its findings. In accordance with procedural code and judicial review, you are hereby ordered to return the Medal of Honor previously awarded for service conducted during Operation Ridge Hammer. Bill didn't speak. He didn't blink. His hand moved inside his coat, slow and measured, pulling out a small velvet box. It looked ordinary in his hand, like a keepsake or an old jewelry case. But inside was a symbol most men would give their lives to earn, and some had. He opened it, revealing the medal, 5-pointed star, golden and blue, still gleaming like it had on the day it was pinned to his uniform by a general with trembling hands. He set the box down on the wooden desk in front of him. He didn't place it loudly or dramatically, he just set it down like he was returning borrowed equipment. Then he stood upright again. His hands returned behind his back. His gaze stayed locked straight ahead. The silence that followed was thick and unnerving. Even the bailiff stopped tapping his pen. The judge gave a faint nod and tapped the gavel once. Dismissed. Bill turned and walked out. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't check if the medal had been taken. He didn't acknowledge the man in the back row who stood quietly as he passed. That man, Daniel Rivas, held the phone lower now, still recording, still unsure if what he'd just filmed was justice or betrayal. He was 26, freelance journalist, a kid to most people in the room. But to Bill, he was something else, entirely. Though the two men hadn't spoken, Daniel's father had served with Bill, died in 2007. Same ambush, same mission, same stretch of hell near the Afghan border where the trees thinned out and the bullets didn't. His name was Carlos Rivas, and he'd been one of the soldiers Bill tried to save. Daniel grew up hearing about that day in whispers, fragments, second-hand stories from men who had trouble sleeping. Outside the courthouse, the air was dry. Autumn leaves scraped along the sidewalk. Bill didn't pause on the steps. He moved down them like he was returning to formation, one step at a time, until his boots hit the pavement. There was no family waiting, no reporters swarming, no car pulling up to drive him away. Just him, his breath in the cold, and years of silence wrapped tight around his shoulders like another uniform he couldn't take off. Daniel stayed across the street. He didn't call out. He didn't wave. He just kept the phone steady as Bill walked away. The footage ended not with drama, but with distance, the back of a man whose country had called him hero and now treated him like a footnote. The video was uploaded that same afternoon. Daniel didn't add commentary, no music, no edits. Just 2 minutes and 13 seconds of raw truth, framed from the back of a courtroom, centered on a moment no one had expected to matter. It spread faster than anyone anticipated. By nightfall, thousands had seen it. By morning, hundreds of thousands more. Veterans reposted it with captions like "Unreal" and "This is how we treat our own now." Others demanded answers. A few former officers commented anonymously, hinting that there was more to the story. People who hadn't heard Bill Keegan's name in years were suddenly remembering a man who once saved lives with nothing but a sidearm and a promise. But Bill didn't know any of that yet. He spent that night like most others, alone in a house that smelled like old books and gun oil, same coffee mug, same creaky chair on the porch. The television stayed off, the phone stayed face down. He read the same paragraph of the same war memoir 3 times without absorbing a word. His thoughts drifted to the metal, the courtroom, and the silence. Always the silence. He didn't know his name was climbing search trends. He didn't know Daniel Rivas was already digging deeper, asking quiet questions in places that didn't like being questioned. He didn't know that somewhere, in a wood-paneled office lined with framed commendations, Colonel Brent Hargrove was watching the same video with a clenched jaw and a plan already forming. What Bill Keegan did know was simple. He had done what they asked. He had returned the medal. He had obeyed the court. And now, he was waiting. For what? He didn't yet know. But the quiet had changed. And for the first time in years, it wasn't the kind of silence that made him feel forgotten. It was the kind that comes right before something explodes. The desert was quiet, almost sacred, the kind of silence that only existed after everything else had been burned away. In 2007, eastern Afghanistan looked more like the surface of the moon than any battlefield described in the training manuals. Dust coated every inch of skin, gear, and rifle, and when it stuck to the blood, it turned everything the same dull, red-brown that never fully washed off. William Keegan's unit had been moving through the Kunar province for 6 days. 12 men, 3 vehicles, 1 objective. Their mission was to retrieve a downed drone before insurgents got to it first. Simple on paper. In reality, it was an exposed, under-supported operation, ordered by someone sitting behind a desk, too. Far from the heat, Keegan was already a legend inside his unit. Not because he bragged, he never did, but because he had that presence, that calm, that only came from having walked out of fire more than once. Men watched how he breathed. If he was relaxed, they were too. If he tensed, they followed orders, without a word. On the 7th day, just past 1400 hours, they moved into a dry riverbed near a village that hadn't been on the last 3 maps. The sun was a hammer overhead. Radio chatter dropped to static. That was the first warning. Then came the crack of the first shot. Then two more. Then hell ambush. Insurgents opened up from the ridgeline. AKs, RPGs, sniper fire. The rocks lit. Up with dust and steel. The Humvee behind Keegan exploded, flipping twice before landing upside down. Screams over the comms, men moving without waiting for permission. Keegan hit the dirt and started calling positions. Two men were pinned behind the wreckage, bleeding. One of them was Carlos Rivas, a calm soldier with a young son back home. Carlos had taken a round to the leg and couldn't move. The other was a private, barely 19, face pale, trying to crawl. There were no medevacs inbound, no overhead support. The command center said air cover was 20 minutes out. They didn't have 20 minutes. Keegan grabbed his sidearm, tossed a smoke grenade toward the ridgeline, and ran. Not crawled, ran. Bullets tore through the air like angry insects. Dust kicked up around his boots. Shrapnel sang past his ears. But he moved without flinching. Reached the two men, dragged one by the collar, then hooked his arms under Carlos's vest and hauled him with sheer brute force. He didn't stop until he was behind cover again. Then he went back for the kid. That mission earned him the Medal of Honor. But not everyone celebrated it. Brent Hargrove, then a colonel assigned to Logistics Command, had been the officer who signed off on the mission's planning. He'd kept his distance from the front. Paperwork, supply chains, patrol rotations. He wore ribbons but had never felt muzzle heat. Keegan had filed an after-action report that called the mission poorly planned and under-resourced. He'd used the phrase, avoidable casualties. That embarrassed Hargrove. Quietly, fatally. His name had ended up on a confidential review sent to the Pentagon. Promotions stalled. Influence faded. He remembered that. Years later, when Keegan retired, he didn't ask for favors. He slipped, out quietly. No book deal, no speaking circuit, no interviews. Just a quiet cabin near the Blue Ridge, a few framed photos, and a porch that creaked when he shifted his weight. The medal stayed in a drawer most days. He never bragged, never corrected those who called him a hero, just nodded and said, "I did my job." But when rumors began circulating about alleged misconduct, expenses, improper recommendations, fraternization, he didn't understand. There were no formal charges at first, just anonymous letters, then internal memos, then calls from former officers saying they were being asked strange questions. His record was being picked apart. By the time the official investigation launched, Hargrove was a rising political figure in his district, pushing hard on military accountability and stolen valor platforms. He did interviews, quoted selectively. Never mentioned Keegan by name, but always referred to certain decorated individuals who may have violated the integrity of the uniform. When the subpoena came, Keegan didn't resist it. He showed up, sat quietly, handed over his medal. What choice did he have? Back in the present, Daniel Rivas was staring at the same photo for the 5th time. His father, Carlos, stood with Keegan and their unit in front of the same ridge where the ambush took place. It was black and white, now faded at the corners, but the pride in their faces was still visible. Men who trusted each other, who relied on one another without question. Daniel had started pulling old military records, Freedom of Information Act requests, archived emails. Something wasn't adding up. The timeline of accusations didn't match. Anything credible. He found inconsistencies in the case summary, identical wording across multiple affidavits, recycled language. A pattern. The video he'd uploaded was now everywhere. National news, military blogs, forums full of veterans furious at what they saw. But Daniel didn't care about clicks. He wanted the truth, not just for Bill, but for his father. Because if Keegan's story was being rewritten, then so was Carlos's. And that meant the people responsible weren't just rewriting history, they were erasing it. Late that night, Bill stood outside, looking at the stars. The cabin was quiet, no traffic, no neighbors, just the hum of insects and the soft crunch of gravel under his boots. He didn't check the news. He didn't know the clip had passed 1 million views, but he could feel it in the air. Something had shifted. He lit a cigarette, hands steady. The past doesn't stay buried. Not forever. By the end of the second day, the video had crossed 2 million views. No captions, no flashy titles, just a quiet courtroom, a military veteran returning the nation's highest honor, and a silence so loaded it felt like a confession, without words. It had started on a small veterans forum, then Reddit, then Twitter. Within hours, the story had pierced through algorithms and news cycles like shrapnel. Bill Keegan didn't know that. He wasn't tracking views. He didn't use social media. His phone had been off for 2 days, but Daniel Rivas was watching everything unfold in real time. His inbox was flooding with requests, reporters, producers, advocacy groups. Some begged for interviews. Others demanded explanations. A few threatened him anonymously, telling him to pull the video or else, but Daniel had already committed. He knew what he had filmed. He knew who Keegan was, and he knew something wasn't right. He stopped answering calls and started building a board, an actual wall in his apartment, covered in documents, red string, timelines. He pulled every public mention of Brent Hargrove over the last 15 years, traced campaign donations, found an old staffer who agreed to talk off the record. He requested military documentation and tracked a trail of retired officers who had quietly moved into defense consulting roles after signing off on Keegan's misconduct inquiry. None of it proved anything. But the pattern was obvious. Meanwhile, the public reaction took on a life of its own. Commentators were split. Some called Keegan a fraud. Others saw him as a scapegoat. Veterans recorded shaky cell phone monologues, recounting their own experiences with how the system chewed up those who didn't play political games. Military families started asking questions. Radio hosts debated the ethics. And through it all, Keegan remained silent. At one point, a retired general went on national television and said, "That man doesn't give back a Medal of Honor unless something's broken. And I don't mean him." Bill watched none of it. He spent his mornings walking a trail behind his house, his afternoons tending to a garden he rarely touched, and his nights reading, though most pages blurred into the same memory. The silence that had once comforted him now pressed in heavier. Not because he regretted returning the medal, but because he didn't understand why it had been taken at all. On the 4th day, Daniel received a message that changed everything. It came from an unlisted address. No name, just a subject line. "You're not wrong." Attached was a document, scanned, low quality but unmistakable. An internal memo dated 3 months before Keegan's hearing. It referenced coordination between Hargrove's office and an unnamed legal team preparing a narrative buffer for public dissemination. The language was vague, but the intent was clear. The accusations hadn't started organically. They had been seeded. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. He verified the metadata, cross-checked the sender's IP, traced it to a city in Virginia near Quantico. Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't proof, but it was the spark he needed. He printed it and got in his car. 4 hours later, he was at Bill's cabin. Keegan answered the door in a flannel shirt and boots, expression unreadable. He didn't invite Daniel in, just stood there, listening as the younger man explained everything. What he'd found, what the video had done, what people were saying, and what might come next. When Daniel finished, Bill was silent for a moment. Then he stepped aside. Inside, the house was simple, clean, Spartan, walls lined with old maps, unit photos, a single folded flag in a display case. Daniel laid out the printouts. Bill read them slowly. His hands didn't shake, but his jaw clenched. Once, not in fear, in recognition, he nodded once and said, "I figured something smelled off." Then he sat down and asked Daniel to start from the beginning. That night, They worked through every document. Bill explained acronyms, operational lingo, and chain of command gaps that Daniel hadn't understood. The older man never raised his voice, never swore, just pointed, underlined, remembered. What started as a one-sided investigation became a team effort, one built on respect, not ego. Meanwhile, the political side began to shift. Brent Hargrove was feeling the pressure. His office issued a carefully worded statement denying involvement in ongoing military justice matters. He went on television to talk about respect for the process and dangerous conspiracy theories. But the deflection didn't work. Every clip was stitched side by side with Keegan's video in comparison reels posted by angry vets, journalists, and influencers who smelled blood in the water. His approval ratings began to slide. Behind the scenes, Hargrove made calls. He reached out to contacts in defense contracting. He tried to get the video discredited. At one point, a fabricated eyewitness account surfaced, claiming Bill had falsified reports during deployment. Within hours, it was debunked. The damage control backfired. And then something happened that no one expected. A member of Keegan's old unit came forward, not on the news, not in a press conference. He uploaded his own video. He said his name, showed his medals, verified his identity. Then he looked into the camera and said, "Everything Bill Keegan did that day saved my life. I watched him carry 2 men out of hell. You don't take a medal from someone like that. You give him another. It spread faster than the original clip." By the end of that week, Bill Keegan was no longer a name hidden behind legal jargon. He was a symbol of broken systems, of unspoken trauma, of the quiet men who did their duty and were left behind. And now, for the first time in years, he was being asked to speak. The invitation came quietly. An email from a nonprofit veteran advocacy group asking Bill Keegan to speak at a closed roundtable discussion on service, sacrifice, and accountability. No press, no cameras, just veterans, some retired officers, and a handful of journalists. Bill read it twice, then closed the laptop. He didn't answer immediately. He sat with it. Let it settle. That night, he walked the length of the trail behind his cabin, past the creek, past the old tree split by lightning years ago, past the part where the dirt still showed remnants of old boots and rain. He thought about the letter. Thought about what it meant to speak now after staying quiet for so long. He hadn't asked for any of this. Hadn't filmed the video, hadn't written a defense, hadn't stood in front of microphones or lobbied for sympathy. He had followed orders, then followed silence. But silence hadn't protected him. It hadn't preserved honor. It had been weaponized. By morning, he responded, "I'll attend. I won't perform." At the round table, the room was plain. Folded chairs. Coffee that had been reheated too many times. Veterans sat with straight backs, the kind of posture that never left. Some wore pins. Some wore nothing but quiet eyes. Daniel sat near the door, notepad closed, just listening. When it was Bill's turn to speak, he stood. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't introduce himself. He just began. "I didn't come here to defend myself," he said. "I came here to tell you something I should have said years ago." The room stilled. "I was awarded the Medal of Honor for an action that happened in 2007. We were ambushed during a recovery mission. 2 men were trapped. I went in. 1 survived, 1 didn't. What most people never hear is what happened after the firefight." He paused, just for breath, not for effect. "I filed a report that criticized the mission planning. Said it lacked proper intel, lacked backup. That report never saw daylight, but someone with a higher rank saw it. And they remembered it." Heads nodded. The veterans in the room knew that look, knew that tone. Quiet payback was a currency in the system. "I didn't expect revenge," Bill said. "I just expected the military to be the thing it claimed to be. But the man I called out, Colonel Brent Hargrove, he waited. He moved on, got political. Then, 20 years later, he made his move. He laid out the events, the false allegations, the sudden review, the quiet courtroom. I returned the medal not because I agreed with the decision, but because I refused to plead for something I had already earned with blood. I thought walking away would protect the people who served with me. But I was wrong. Silence doesn't protect anyone. It erases them. A murmur passed through the room. Bill closed with one sentence. You cannot claim to honor service if you punish truth. The discussion ended in silence, but not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that means people are processing something they can't ignore. That evening, Daniel published an article. He included transcripts from the round table, anonymized comments, corroborating documents, and a full timeline of events. He didn't write emotionally. He wrote precisely. He told the story straight, just as Bill had asked. The article exploded. Within 48 hours, national outlets picked it up. Military officials were forced to issue statements. Congressional representatives began calling for reviews. Some demanded Hargrove testify. Others issued press releases distancing themselves. Hargrove doubled down. He appeared on 3 talk shows in one day. He accused online mobs of creating false heroes. He called the Round Table a political stunt. But his voice had changed. He was tighter, less confident. For the first time, the mask was cracking. Then came the leak. A former assistant from Hargrove's office sent Daniel a series of internal memos. These weren't vague. These were direct. Explicit coordination with legal consultants, wording suggestions, talking points, a list of targeted veterans with Keegan's name underlined twice. It was over. The next morning, Bill received a phone call from the Secretary of the Army. Not an aide, not a liaison. The Secretary himself. He offered an apology, off the record, said that the medal's revocation would be formally reviewed, that what had happened did not reflect the values of the Army or the country. Bill said only, I don't want a reversal. I want the record corrected. That afternoon, the Medal of Honor citation was reinstated. Quietly, no ceremony, no cameras, just an email and an official bulletin posted online. Bill didn't throw a party. He didn't post a video. He went back to his porch, coffee in hand, watching the rain streak down the railing. Daniel joined him later that week. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Bill said, You knew what that video would do, didn't you? Daniel nodded. I didn't know it'd fix anything. I just knew it had to be seen. Bill smiled for the first time in days. A real smile. Tired, but genuine. You did what a good soldier does, he said. You watched someone's back. That night, Daniel began working on a new piece, not about Keegan, but about all the other veterans who had been quietly pushed aside, silenced, or punished for telling the truth. He didn't want to make Bill the face of a movement. He wanted to make him a warning. That silence, when enforced from above, isn't discipline. It's corruption. Bill returned to his quiet life. He didn't seek more spotlight. But people wrote to him, soldiers, widows, strangers, not asking for help, just saying thank you. And for the first time in years, he started writing letters back. The hearing room wasn't grand. No marble columns or sweeping staircases, just rows of chairs, a single elevated platform, and microphones arranged with surgical precision. Brent Hargrove sat in the center, flanked by aides who looked like they were waiting for an impact they couldn't predict. The lights were bright. The cameras were real this time. The silence wasn't comfortable. Across the room, committee members adjusted their papers. One by one, they opened statements, read dates, quoted laws. Then they turned toward Hargrove and asked him to respond. His voice was calm at first. He repeated rehearsed phrases. Respect for process. Unfortunate misunderstanding. commitment to military values. But every question pulled another thread. Why had the review into William Keegan begun off record? Why were internal memos coordinated before any official complaint was filed? Why were identical phrases found in multiple affidavits from unrelated officers? He began to sweat. One committee member read directly from a leaked email. Create a narrative buffer before public reaction escalates. Another pointed to campaign donations linked to consulting firms named in the document trail. When asked about the targeting of other veterans listed in the file, Hargrove paused too long before answering. The chairwoman leaned forward. Colonel Hargrove, did you use your influence to orchestrate the revocation of a Medal of Honor to retaliate against someone who exposed you 2 decades ago? He shifted in his seat. I never issued an order to revoke. That wasn't the question. I advised. So you were involved. Silence. Cameras flashed. The damage was done. The headlines wrote themselves before he even left the building. Hargrove under federal ethics investigation. Congress demands inquiry into weaponized military justice. Veterans Medal revoked as political retaliation. That same afternoon, Daniel published the final part of his series. He titled it simply, The Medal and the Machine. He didn't write it to celebrate victory. He wrote it as a warning. That power unchecked becomes punishment. That silence enforced from above isn't order, it's erasure. Bill Keegan read it on. His porch, every word. Slowly. His medal had been reinstated, but it didn't shine any brighter. It still lived in a box inside a drawer. He didn't wear it. He didn't need to. What mattered now was that the truth wasn't buried anymore. People kept writing to him. Some shared stories. Others sent apologies on behalf of a country that hadn't known. A few just said thank you. Bill answered each letter by hand. Short, clear, respectful. He didn't give advice. He just listened. That, he believed, was the job now. 2 weeks later, a group of veterans knocked on his door. Men from his old unit. One used a cane. Another had gone gray, lost an arm. They didn't come for a speech. They came to say something they hadn't said back then. You saved us, one said. But what you did after, standing quiet while they tried to take everything, that's what stuck with me. Bill didn't respond with words. He opened the door wider, let them in. They sat on the porch that evening, shared stories, laughed. Quietly, the kind of laughter that carries pain in the background but refuses to be drowned by it. They stayed late, left quietly, promised to return. Meanwhile, Daniel was invited to speak at a university, his alma mater. He walked into the auditorium wearing the same jacket he'd worn in the courtroom, not to be symbolic, but because it still fit. The audience was full of students, veterans, journalists. He didn't open with the video. He opened with a line from his father's journal. Don't confuse following orders with doing what's right. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier does is refuse. He spoke for 20 minutes, then opened for questions. One student asked if he considered himself an activist now. Daniel paused. I consider myself someone who saw something wrong and didn't look away. That shouldn't be activism. That should be normal. When he returned home, there was a letter waiting, handwritten, from Bill. It said only this: Your father would have been proud. I am too. That night, Daniel framed it. Hargrove, meanwhile, was stripped of his political endorsements. A federal review opened into his past campaign operations. No formal charges yet. But the silence around him had changed. No one defended him anymore. His press team resigned quietly. The machine had turned cold. He had become the symbol of something even his allies didn't want to stand beside. But Bill wasn't celebrating. He still walked the trail every morning, still drank the same coffee, still watched the same sun rise over the same trees. But something was different now. Not louder, just lighter. For years, He had carried a burden no one saw. The guilt, the silence, the quiet feeling of being discarded by the institution he gave everything to. That burden hadn't disappeared, but it no longer pressed down with the same weight. It had been named, acknowledged, faced. That made all the difference. He wasn't looking to become anyone's hero. He wasn't trying to lead anything. But now, when other veterans reached out, those who had been overlooked, investigated unfairly, punished in silence, he answered them, listened, shared what he'd learned. He didn't pretend to fix anything, but he helped make sure they didn't walk through it alone, and sometimes that was enough. In the end, William Keegan didn't reclaim the spotlight. He reclaimed something far more important: his name, his truth, and the dignity that never should have been taken. He didn't need a ceremony to validate his sacrifice. The battlefield had already done that. But what mattered was that someone stood up, recorded, questioned, and refused to stay quiet when silence was safer. That someone wasn't a general or a senator. It was a young man with a phone and a sense of justice inherited from a father who never came home. This story isn't just about medals or politics. It's about how easily we forget the cost of service when the uniform is folded away. It's about the systems that fail the very people they claim to honor. And it's about what happens when someone, just one person, decides not to let it go. For every Bill Keegan out there, there are others still in the shadows, carrying scars in silence, wondering if anyone remembers what they gave. Let this be a reminder. They're not forgotten. Not while stories like this are told. Not while we keep asking hard questions. Not while the truth still has a voice. If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Ask yourself what silence costs and who pays the price. And if you believe that honor shouldn't be decided by politics, but by truth, subscribe. Because these stories deserve to be heard, and some battles don't end on the battlefield. They end right here, with us.